Well, folks, it's real good to be back with you today. I'm always happy to sit here and talk to you about the great past of history, of Bristol and its history. Bristol does have a very interesting past. It has a very unique history. I saw that from the very beginning. My first job here, of course, took me into the home of a lot of aged citizens, and that's where I began to take an interest in the history of the city. It was grand. I think it might have been the last time we were on that I talked about a lady who had been a slave. They called her the Totem Woman, and like so many, she had to eke out a living of some kind after they were freed. A lot of them flocked into Bristol thinking that the city would offer some kind of work that they could do to make a living. Well, at the time, I knew there were some others in my mind that I could think of if I'd just try real hard, or maybe look back on notes. I've got notes here by the bushel, and see. Well, one did come to mind who made a living with a very unusual occupation. The Totem Woman, of course, had an unusual occupation. A woman making deliveries for the grocery stores or for any kind of delivery. It didn't have to be groceries. And of course, I think I mentioned about Caesar Sousson, who made his living by fiddling for the public on the streets. Give him a dime, nickel, quarter, and he'd play any tune you wanted just about it. And I'm sure there were many others. Some were lucky enough to find permanent jobs in the homes as domestics. And some of the men were lucky to find jobs as yard men and so on, keeping the gardens. Virtually every home at that time in Bristol had a garden out back. This house did right here, and a house next door and all around had their, nearly always had a garden in the back. And they needed someone usually to tend it. And oftentimes they employed an ex-slave to do that. An ex-slave worked here in the yard, and his mother at the same time was doing domestic work inside. As to Caesar Sousson, he came from the old Sousson family. Well, one of the daughters of that old original family, they were one of the very early pioneer settlers in the area that became Bristol. They arrived here in 1794, on the day that the noted General Shelby, for whom Fort Shelby's name was buried. In fact, so the elders of the group, men, let the ladies stay with the wagons, and they hastened over to be at the funeral and burial of General Shelby. So with that, we know it was in early December of 1794. One of the daughters of that family married a Cowan. The name Cowan was here very early too. There was a very old pioneer family with that name settled in the Holston Valley. And some way, one of the sons of that family came several miles to go a-courting at the Sousson place, which is over near one of the big shopping centers now on Euclid Avenue. Somehow they met and married. Well, they prospered, took a big spread of land right around where Steel Creek Park is now. Much of that land that's still usable there, it was made into the park, was Cowan land. And where the big lake starts there was also Cowan land. Well, they, of course, were farmers like virtually everybody else in the country here, but they had a good operation. They became rather wealthy, and they had a number of slaves. One of those slaves had the unusual name of Baxter Boaz Cowan. Most people shortened it to BB. They'd call him Old BB. Well, he, like so many others, after the war ended, he had to either get out and go somewhere, like several did, or try to find a way to make a living here. Well, he remembered that on the Gilead place, or on the Cowan place, there was a very big spring. It flowed out from under the mountain on the south side of the area where the park is. It's underwater now. I guess maybe the water still flows there. I don't know. But it was covered up by the lake when it was built. The Cowans used that for their water source. And they began to decide after several years' usage, none of the family was sick. They were all in good health. And that was so very rare in those days for that to happen to any family. And some of the family members lived to be extremely old, and including the old grandmother that lived in the home. She was the first that they took note of. She always drank water from that spring, and she lived to be about 99, something like that, and stayed very healthy and very chipper, so to speak, and pretty well was able to carry on their work right up to the final year. They just decided, in that most things were not that well with people around here, that spring had healing qualities. And of course the news spread. They called it Gilead, the Gilead Spring, and the mountain behind it, little mountain as it is, was called Mount Gilead. Actually, they were thinking of the mountain mentioned in the Bible. It was called the healing place, Mount Gilead, and so they named their spring, thinking it was a healing water, Gilead Springs. Well, this old ex-slave remembered that, and being right downtown in Bristol, he also knew that the water here was not much good. The water level at the time was very low under Bristol, downtown Bristol. You could almost dig a well with a post hole digger. But the water was not good. It had a rotten taste to it, rotten leaf taste. Two people at least, made real deep wells, and their wells were popular with the people to the point that people just about drew them dry of water. Dr. Zimmerman had a good well, and so did Joe Anderson. But that was not the case with most people. The stores, most of them had a well out back. It was so easy to dig, about 9 or 10 feet, and you strike water. But it was surface water and was not much good. So, knowing that these people over town had heard of the Gilead Spring, old Boaz, BB as they called him, Baxter Boaz, he decided he could make a little money by carrying water from that spring into town to sell. He prepared himself a yoke around his neck, fit around the back of his neck, and on each end of that yoke you could hang 2 buckets, and that's what he did. 2 1-gallon buckets. I think the buckets were given to him by old W. James, who had something in the store had been sold in them, and they fixed them up for him to bring the water from the spring. Well, apparently the old fellow was an industrious, good worker. Every morning at 4 o'clock, he'd make the first trip walking, and it's a pretty good hike from downtown down to the Steel Creek Park. I wouldn't have a guess at the mileage, 2.5 miles, maybe 3, I don't know. I've driven it several times, and I know it's a long journey down there. Every morning about 4 a.m., he would throw the rope around his neck with the buckets hanging dry, and down the road he'd go, walk all the way down there. Probably walk the old stage road part of the way, and then to the left was the Great Spring. It's now underwater, not too far from where the water ends there. He'd fill his buckets, and by the time he got back to Bristol, the town was up. People rose early in those days, and oftentimes the merchants opened at 6 o'clock in the morning. In fact, if you worked for a store here then, you had to be prepared to work from 6 in the morning till 6 at night. And he would come downtown and people got used to him and would look for him. He'd make his trip round his neck with the yoke and those big buckets full with water hanging from each end. He got 10 cents per bucket. That'd be 40 cents for what he had on his shoulders. And it was a sellout. People would buy it real quick. Well, when he got his first round made, down the way he would go again with the empty buckets. I don't know, I asked an old timer about how many trips they thought he made a day, but they didn't know. But every trip meant 40 cents to him. Well, that seems an awful little for work nowadays, but in those days, 40 cents and 80 cents and $1.20 then for the next trip, why, very few people were making $1 a day. Store clerks were working for about $5 a week. And so he actually was making good money. And finally, the demand was so great, he couldn't fill it. And W. James, father-in-law of old Captain Wood, he told him he ought to go up to 15 cents, which he did. Finally, he was able to buy a horse and a little buggy of some kind, a little cart. I don't think it's a buggy, just a little open cart, I think. And then he could get at least 10 or 12 buckets in the cart, and the business grew. Well, he would be seen daily going down to the spring, back and forth in his little cart, making a living for himself. Oh, that many people were that industrious today. There was no welfare to live on. There was nothing like that. There was no government aid for the poor. The city of Bristol, Virginia finally eked out about maybe $2 a month to some people who couldn't make their own living, but he had a job that supplied him with a good living. Well, I think it was in October, according to what the old man told me about it, that he remembered him very well. Of course, he was 97 years old 60 years ago, so you can figure how old he would have been. He told me he remembered well that he went downtown to meet him, going to get a couple of buckets of water. He had company come in, and he thought he was going to get a couple of buckets. Well, daylight came. Usually he's back here by daylight with the first set of buckets, and he did not show up. Well, somebody downtown said we were up when he went down through town with the little cart. He should be back by now. Or the day passed, noon came, afternoon came, and he still didn't come. Well, by then they began to be worried about him, and 2 or 3 men saddled up their horses and rode down the way. And they found old B.B. Baxter Boaz. He was lying dead by the spring. He had several buckets already filled, but there were several empty buckets still on the cart. Evidently, he had tried to fill his little cart with water and died in the process. And so ended this saga of Baxter Boaz, old B.B. Cowan. Many old-timers remembered him when I first came here, but his memory is all but gone. I'm glad that I can share it with you, and maybe you'll remember him through your lifetime. Thank you, folks, for being my viewers today, and I wish you well with may the best in life be yours.